The Welfare State Vision, from the chapter Political Factors in Wealth, Poverty, and Politics by Thomas Sowell. In a democratic country, a welfare state can be created only after a welfare state vision is created and prevails politically. Therefore, in assessing the effect of a welfare state, we must include the effects of that vision as well as the effects of the particular institutions and policies created. Among the assumptions behind the welfare state vision, two seem crucial. One, many people are mired in a degree of poverty that a prosperous society can and should relieve. And two, many, if not most, of the people in poverty never had the same chance of a better life as others who ended up more prosperous. Even in a society with rules that are fair, in the sense of judging everyone by the same standards and rewarding or punishing them according to the same criteria, it would still be true that someone born in the South Bronx would have nothing like the same probability of achieving economic success, however defined, as someone born in an elegant Park Avenue neighborhood. To be fair, in the sense of providing equal probabilities of success for people born in unequal social circumstances would be very different. In that sense, life has been unfair in virtually every society of the past or the present. The case of the welfare state vision has seldom been made more clear than by Nicholas Kristof of the New York Times. Quoting Nicholas Kristof, "One delusion common among America's successful people is that they triumph just because of hard work and intelligence. In fact, their big break came when they were conceived in middle-class American families who loved them, read them stories, and nurtured them with Little League sports, library cards, and music lessons. They were programmed for success by the time they were zygotes." The social conditions into which individuals are born and raised are of course not equal, just as the geographic, demographic, and cultural conditions in which the individuals, groups, and nations find themselves are not equal in their economic prospects. This has been true throughout recorded history. No doubt many of us wish that things were different, and some want to do something about it. But everything depends on just what specifically is the something that is done. The welfare state is just one option among many. Mr. Kristof's response to the unfairness of life is to criticize those who are oblivious of their own advantages and of other people's disadvantages. He accuses them of a mean-spiritedness in the political world, or, at best, a lack of empathy toward those struggling, partly because the hostility to state expansion of Medicaid, to long-term unemployment benefits, or to raising the minimum wage to keep up with inflation. In short, Kristof's response to the unfairness of life is a government transfer of resources from those who are more prosperous to those who are less prosperous, with no caveats about the further consequences of such welfare state policies or its accompanying vision, and no apparent apprehension about whether those consequences will make either the less prosperous or society at large better off or worse off on net balance. To blithely assume that the only reason to be against minimum wage laws is a lack of empathy with the poor is to ignore a vast literature on the negative repercussions of minimum wage laws. These repercussions include increased numbers of unemployed young males idle on the streets, which is seldom a benefit to any community. 10 years after the passage of the federal minimum wage law in the United States, the Fair Labor Standards Act of 1938, the wartime inflation in the intervening years had so raised prices and wages that the minimum wage specified in that law was below what inexperienced and unskilled workers were already being paid, so that by 1948 the economic situation in most places was the same as if there were no minimum wage law. The unemployment rate among black 16 and 17-year-olds that year was just under 10%, but in later years the minimum wage was repeatedly raised to keep up with the inflation. Unemployment among blacks this age never again fell below 20%. It was 27% a decade later in 1958 and 45% in 1975. It is one of the most elementary principles of economics that prices artificially raised above the level set by supply and demand creates unsaleable surpluses. Whether what is being sold is agricultural produce or labor, regardless of the presence or absence of empathy. Despite a common claim advanced by Christoph, among many others, that slavery and post-slavery oppression left a legacy of broken families among blacks, the plain fact is that the proportion of black children living with only one parent was never as large during the first 100 years after slavery as it became in the first 30 years after the great expansion of the welfare state, beginning in the 1960s. Yet the legacy of slavery argument continues to be blithely repeated, and the legacy of the welfare state ignored. The proportion of black children being raised by a single mother in 1960 was 22%. 35 years later, that proportion had risen to 52%, being raised by a mother alone, 4% being raised by a father alone, and another 11% being raised with neither parent present, altogether 67% of all black children. By 1995, the proportion of black children in poverty-level families who were being raised without a father present was 85%. The central rationale for the welfare state is poverty, but if the word is to have any specific meaning, someone must define it in specific terms. Once that is done, poverty means no more and no less than those specifications, however much the word may conjure up images from a past era when poverty meant hunger, ragged clothing, cramped housing, and the like. Today, poverty in America means whatever government statisticians in Washington say it means, and they are unlikely to define it in ways that would jeopardize the welfare state of which they are part. Most people living below the official poverty line in the United States in 2001 had central air conditioning and a microwave oven, for example. In fact, these items were more common among the officially poor in 2001 they were among the American population as a whole in 1980. Most poverty-level households in 2001 had cable television and 2 or more television sets. As of 2003, nearly 3/4 of officially poverty-level households owned at least one motor vehicle, and 14% owned 2 or more. In contrast to times past when low-income people lived in overcrowded dwellings, Americans living below the official poverty level today have more housing space per person than the average European, not poor Europeans, but the average European. As a scholar who spent years studying Latin America put it, the poverty line in the United States is the upper middle class in Mexico. This is not to say that Americans living in official poverty have no problems. They have serious and often catastrophic social problems, but these are seldom the result of material deprivation and are far more often the result of social degeneration, much of it representing social retrogressions during the era of the rising welfare state and of the pervasive, non-judgmental welfare state ideology.